scrutiny.
Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to make a short contribution in the 5 minutes I have available to the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Foreign Fighters Bill of 2014. As a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, I can assure Senator Wright and other senators in this place that there has in fact been robust and deep scrutiny of this bill, listening to a wide range of witnesses and, importantly, also to the evidence provided by the security agencies who work tirelessly on behalf of the people of Australia to ensure our security and also to ensure that we meet our obligations to the broader global community around security. Just to put into context, on the 24th of September this year, the United Nations Security Council met and passed a unanimous resolution requiring that all 193 UN member states to prosecute and penalise people who travel or attempt to travel aboard for terrorism training or help finance such efforts, to deny entry to anyone they have reasonable grounds to believe could be supporting or participating in terror-related activities, and to share airline passenger information records and other personal details with international databases to help track and prevent the movement of suspected foreign fighters. It's only the 6th time in 70 years that the Security Council has met with heads of nations, representing the nations, and it has met in those times to address the most urgent threats to peace and security. And what we do see here is that whilst there are urgent threats, and we are seeing those play out both on the global stage, particularly with the events in northern Iraq and in Syria, we are also seeing here in Australia, as we've seen just recently in Melbourne, also in Canada and the United States, there are emerging and changing threats of people who support the ideology of Daesh or the Islamic State. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security did scrutinise these bills and made 36 recommendations. And as Senator Collins pointed out before, it was a bipartisan effort where members from both the government and opposition looked at the bill and made suggestions as to how to improve it so that we captured the operational effect that the agencies need to ensure the safety of Australians, but at the same time we increase the balance to make sure that essential freedoms are preserved and that there are checks such as sunset clauses to make sure that these don't, without due cause, become a permanent feature of our legislation. I'd just like to quickly address some of the key points that have raised concern. The issue of advocacy. One of the problems in the past is that people who have been seeking to inculcate in young, impressionable minds the mindset that this is something that is not only permissible but required by their ideology have been very smart and very clever to walk the fine line to avoid the current law which would capture them. And what we are seeing is that we have a generation of people who have been inculcated to a point where the process from that inculcation to action, to that radicalisation, is very short. And it's quite important that we have the ability to circumvent and to prevent those enabling conditions such that we do not have this body of young people, or in fact some cases older people, who've been radicalised to the point where they can decide to act and very quickly move forward. We've seen a number of cases where the so-called hate preachers have walked that fine line but have inculcated into minds the willingness to act, and this is a way of preventing that. Importantly, they commit an offence if they intentionally counsel, promote, encourage or urge the doing of a terrorist act or the commission of a terrorism offence, and the person is reckless as to whether another person will engage in a terrorist act or commit a terrorist offence. Now, there are a number of things in there, particularly the reckless element, that is important, that does provide protections from a free speech perspective. Importantly also, there is a safeguard there that there is an existing defence for acts that are done in good faith, such as political communication or publishing a report or commentary about a matter of public interest. The sunset clauses, as we talked about, are important measures, and we've reduced the timeframes on those to make sure that this doesn't become a continuing feature of our law. But the arrest thresholds is an important part, as we've seen, with increasingly the change from large groups with complex plans seeking to have mass casualty events, and we've had very good records in Australia of our existing laws enabling our security forces to have things like Operation Pendennis, where we defeated the threat against the MCG in Melbourne. Now we're seeing people operating as small groups or individuals very quickly with no great planning required in terms of their equipment. And so it's important to change the threshold to enable our security officers to act in a timely manner to make sure that they can apprehend people and prevent those occurrences. And so the threshold is being changed to require that an officer of the law has reasonable grounds to suspect rather than the threshold of reasonable grounds for belief. Now, this is not arbitrary. Some factual basis for the submission must be shown. And it's also important to recognise it's not a new concept in Australia, with many states and territories already having an arrest threshold which is based on suspicion. Lastly, to the issue of biometric measures. For biometric measures, we've seen a case where somebody left Australia with manual checking in an airport and went and joined terrorist fighters overseas. We already use biometric measures for people coming into Australia. Many would be familiar with eGate. This provides the ability to use that same technology outbound. It meets the obligations that we have signed up to through the United Nations. It means that we can use existing technology, existing privacy safeguards, just on outgoing as well as incoming passengers to prevent the kind of occurrence that occurred in Australia before. One final comment on declared areas. This is not an offence of strict liability. The DPP still has the discretion as to when to actually bring a case against an individual. And so if there is a range of background factors and other information that is in the brief, and the DPP cannot, for whatever reason, use another law, this provides an opportunity to bring a case against an individual who has travelled to a declared area. But a declared area, somewhere like Mosul, during the public hearings on this, witnesses were questioning why somebody wouldn't be free, for example, to go and do language training. Well, as I put to that witness, in an area like Mosul, where every reasonable person has either fled or has been executed through decapitation or crucifixion, what reasonable person would seek to travel to Mosul to do education training? It just does not make sense. And because this is not a strict liability offence, all the people that were talked about in terms of journalism and foreign aid workers would not automatically be captured when they came back, because whole regions are unlikely, in fact specifically countries, are not going to be able to be declared areas. And so this offence is not the dire restriction on freedom of movement that has been claimed. Because it's not strict liability, the DPP has a discretion to include it as part of a brief of evidence. Mr Acting Deputy President, my time has expired, but I commend this bill to the House. It has had good scrutiny by the process that's been set up by this parliament, which has worked well for many years through the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and I commend it to the Senate.